As the protesters and pro-Maduro forces clash on the streets of Venezuela, television and internet access in the country has now been restricted, including CNN. NetBlocks is a company that monitors the restrictions, and it reports access to social media networks and sites like Google have been shut off and cut off. NetBlocks says VPN services remain effective as a workaround. Samuel Burke is tracking it all. First of all, for those of us who don't understand all of this, how do you cut off the internet? You just sort of cut off the sort of the pipe coming into the country?
No, really the way they do it is start cutting it off service by service, and they start with the biggest ones, the way that you're just showing on the screen there, Richard. YouTube, Android, these are the biggest platforms in the world, so if you're able to just cut off access to one particular server, that really means you're cutting off access to the internet. But what's so interesting here is if you look at some of the data that this group, NetBlocks, is showing us, it's only affecting users of CAN TV. This is the internet that's run by the state. You have options of getting private internet or the one that's backed by the state, and it's only the state-backed internet that is seeing these cuts. That leads experts to believe that the Maduro government is behind this block.
Right, but what's the purpose? I mean, I don't know whether you're familiar with the percentage that will be getting it from that versus from private. I mean, assuming you can afford it at all. I mean, how much does this government-supplied service have?
Estimates are north of 80% in years past. We don't have updated numbers given the situation in Venezuela, but that means you're obviously cutting off huge swaths of the internet for people and maybe blocking people then from seeing what type of activity is going on, the same way that CNN is blocked in Venezuela, and maybe stopping people from going to the streets to gather and protest against the government.
I mean, is that the point? Is that to prevent the net, to prevent social media from being used as a rallying cry?
It's a classic case of stopping the flow of information, but there are also these unintended consequences, Richard. I'm fascinated by the fact that you would think that Venezuela, a place that has these constant outages of internet and one of the slowest internet connections in the world, that they wouldn't be using mobile payments. But because there's such a lack of cash in Venezuela, you can't get your hands on cold, hard cash, so people have actually been using mobile payments at higher rates than neighboring countries. So it means when there's a blockage like this, the already crippled Venezuelan economy gets even worse because, of course, if you can't connect to the internet, you're not using mobile payments.
We've been hearing from a variety of different people. Marco Rubio has been speaking. Many US politicians have been speaking. But it's not exactly clear where this goes next.
And it's interesting because Marco Rubio, the senator from the United States, was actually tweeting about the internet block, and he alleged that maybe China was involved in some way. I've been speaking to one of his aides who said, well, they're talking about, he was talking about ways that Chinese companies have been alleged, according to media reports, to have provided tools to Venezuela to monitor tracking, but there's no sign that there was any Chinese involvement in this current blockage. Where does it go next? Well, I think if you look at the control of the internet, that might be one way of indicating. And you look at also the popularity of certain people on the internet, and that's often a case of where it goes next. I think the most difficult part is knowing that for Venezuelans, it gets much more difficult without cash, without mobile payments. Everyday life, no matter who's in power in the next week or month, becomes that much more difficult as these blockages continue.